I want to thank you all for coming out. Obviously, you didn't have anything else to do other than stand out in the rain. I got interested in this topic for a couple of reasons. One, I used to live in Massachusetts. I was there for a long time. And you can still visit the site where some of this event took place. Also, because I've been an expert witness on many occasions, I'm kind of interested in the interactions of experts with legal authorities. And this is a good good example of a case. What happens when the authorities don't listen to their own experts? And so we're going to talk. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you sort of we're going to do a little Q&A at first, and then we're going to sort of give you a little bit of a historical background, provide some context, go through a rough chronology of what happened in the course of the witchcraft hysteria, and then look at some of the explanations that have been proffered to account for what happened. So to get started here, there we go. Let me ask you a question. How many witches were burned in Salem in 1692, 1693? Come on.
19?
Yeah. Well, somebody says 19. Well, 19 were executed. 0 were burned. They hanged the witches. In fact, burning was done in Scotland. It was done on the continent, but not in England and not in the colonies. Yes?
Wasn't one or two of them pressed to death?
Giles Corey was pressed to death. That was because he refused to plead, yea or nay, to the charges. Okay. Witchcraft started with a group of children experimenting with fortune telling. Yes or no? How many thinks yes?
True.
Nah. Actually, we don't know, and it's probably false. There's only one account that actually mentions it, and it's peripheral. Actually, they began to become afflicted, as you'll see, before they got into that. Okay. Actually, there's one of the afflicted, Susanna Shelton, who may have been experimenting with fortune telling, but it's not true of all the rest of them. Men were as likely as women to be accused as witches. Yes or no? That's false. Yeah, you got that one right. Yeah, it's witchcraft. The witches are typically women. Okay, except in this case, eventually they decided that they had a witchcraft conspiracy and a witch church, and they needed a head of it, so it had to be a man. So George Burroughs got designated. The majority were midwives. Yes or no? No, they weren't. No, that's been offered as say they were targeted because they were midwives, but in fact there's no evidence that any of them, so far as I know, were actually midwives. They were always convicted. Yes or no? This whole not just in Salem, but throughout the history of New England witchcraft. Yes or no? No. Yeah, you figure I'm kind of telegraphing my punches here with the way I'm asking the questions. Okay. Okay. Another one, Tituba, the slave of Samuel Parris, who baked the witch cake, part of the things that really precipitated the widespread hysteria, was African. Yes or no? That's false, yeah. That's common, and you'll see it in productions of The Crucible. They'll have an African-American actress playing that part. She's in fact an Indian. In fact, her full name is Tituba Indian in the records. These were the last prosecutions in witchcraft prosecutions, what is now the U.S. Yes or no? No. Yeah, that was, again, I telegraphed that one. In fact, we'll find out. We may actually, one case is supposedly, the last case was actually in 1878. Now, it isn't actually a criminal case, so I don't think it really qualifies, but it's worth mentioning. Okay, so let's go back now to the 17th century when this took place. Okay, everybody believes in witches. If you didn't believe in witches, you were probably a crypto-atheist. No witches, no God. That was actually said by, I think, Sir Thomas Browne in one of his writings, or when he was testifying in one of the witchcraft cases. Christians believed in Satan. They believed that God gave Satan power to afflict persons, and most Calvinists, which the Puritans were, believed that Satan headed an anti-church with a hierarchy and liturgy mimicking that of the Christian church. And in fact, they supposedly, at their Sabbaths, they supposedly recited the Lord's Prayer backwards. And that one possible test then of a suspected witch was to get them to recite the Lord's Prayer the right way around, and supposedly they would stumble because they weren't used to reciting it that way. And when he came to be executed, George Burroughs, as a kind of a last desperate attempt to save his life, recited the Lord's Prayer faultlessly. Unfortunately, Cotton Mather was in the crowd and pointed out that this was just a superstition and had no legal meaning. So Burroughs was hanged. The Satan then tempted or afflicted people to get their allegiance, and the afflictions could come directly from Satan or it could come from his minions, his accomplices, the witches. And then you would sign Satan's book and then participate in the witches' sabbats. And that's how you were recruited. If you were if you're thinking about how would I go join up, this is how you do it. Okay, all right. Now there was a controversial aspect here in these trials that we're going to talk about. That is, this was in England, but especially here in New England, was use of spectral evidence, where the accusers claimed to have seen the specters of the accused afflicting them. And many of the witchcraft, in fact, I would say most of the witchcraft trials at Salem involved spectral attacks on the accusers in court, which is very handy because you needed two witnesses to an act of witchcraft. Well, you got the judges right there on the bench, two witnesses right there to the actual act of witchcraft. The specters often confessed to serious crimes. Sometimes they would claim to see specters of victims. So, for example, George Burroughs' deceased wife appeared to one of the girls and said that he had murdered her and showed where he supposedly had stabbed her, where Burroughs had stabbed the deceased in the side. It sounds, if you think about this, some of this sounds a good bit like the psychic detectives of the present day. And that's one of the reasons that psychic detectives are kind of dangerous people, because they can lead to false accusations in the same way that the afflicted were able to bring false accusations against supposed witches. Now, important question, did the accused witches send forth the specters, or were they delusions created by Satan? That's a really critical point. In fact, we'll find later that one important figure who opposed the trials basically argued Satan could do this, and so this shouldn't have any legal weight in a court of law. And issue is, could Satan send forth specters of innocent men and women to get them condemned? Okay. There were three other tests that were used. One is overlooking, the glance of which sends the accusers into fits. By the way, this is where the word fascination comes from. You're fascinated. You fascinate somebody by gazing on them, and it's the evil eye. It's interesting that Harvard had adopted a textbook in science in 1687, which is about 5 years before the trials took place, which specifically repudiated the notion of the evil eye. There was a touch test where if the person goes into fits, the witch touches them, and then that alleviates the fit. And some of the supporters of the trials came up with a scientific explanation that the witch's eyes sent forth malefic particles which were struck and were accumulated in the body of the afflicted, causing them to go into fits. And then when the witch touched the victim, the malefic particles flowed back into the witch. It's kind of you will recognize that's an older theory of vision, that the eye projected particles, and then that's how you saw, not that you just received rays coming from surfaces. And the other thing they would look for would be a devil's mark and a unnatural excrescence on the body. Given standards of hygiene and things like that, probably everybody had something on their body that looked kind of weird. Let me give you some social and political background, because this is kind of important. These people are not living in some sort of bucolic paradise. They're living on the edge of the world. As I like to say in Salem Village, they weren't on the actual edge of the world, but they could see it from there, because they only have to go a couple of townships and you're in the wilderness that's filled with Native Americans. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, the government had actually been abolished for a short period of time. They'd been incorporated into the Dominion of New England, and under an a very autocratic governor had been appointed by James II, Edmund Andros. They actually overthrew him and put him in prison. He escaped, and they were afraid for a while he was going to be reappointed by William and Mary to resume his governorship. And this guy was a real despot. A new charter and a new governor were on the way from England. What was called the Second Indian War, or what's known as King William's War, had broken out in 1689, would continue until after the trials were over. So these people, they're constant Indian attacks. The men are being called up in the militia to have to go out and patrol the roads in Salem Village to make sure that they intercept any Indian raiders. And there'd been a smallpox epidemic. Okay, so this is, these people are living in a very, very stressful environment. It's not safe anywhere they're at. This is a map of Salem Village. You probably can't see it very well here. This is actually the Ipswich River going up here, and here's Salem town right down here. This is Northfields, and then this is the village over here. It later became the town of Danvers. Parsonage is here, the meeting house is here. Ingersoll's Ordinary, which was a tavern, place where you could stay. And you can see where some of the people lived. Thomas Putnam's family were among the accusers. Bridget Bishop was one of those who was accused. She was actually, this was her second go at being tried. She'd been tried and acquitted earlier of being a witch. The Proctors lived down here. Francis and Rebecca Nurse lived right in there. This is from Charles Upham's book that came out in the 19th century. Upham had the advantage that he was both minister of the church in Salem Village, Salem town, but also he was a mayor of the town. So he kind of knew a lot about the families and so forth and the various conflicts. Okay, so let's start our little timeline here. Let's go back we'll start in 1688. This is 4 years before the major outbreak. There is an episode here involving what's called the Goodwin case. Martha Goodwin is bewitched by Goody Glover. She is ultimately executed. This case is investigated by Cotton Mather, who attempts to treat Goodwin. He publishes the account of the case in this book, Memorable Providences Relating to Witchcrafts and Possessions. There were other people involved in studying this case. Samuel Willard is one. We're going to meet him again. He was another minister. Next year, Samuel Parris becomes a new minister in Salem Village. There's a lot of intense interest among the educated elite at this period in witchcraft. An example of that is what I've labeled here, the theses physicae. These theses were argued at commencements at colleges. You would have a proposition, it would be argued pro and con to display the rhetorical skills of the graduates. And so they had theses about witchcraft. One of them was witchcraft exists and people can compound with the devil, can compact with the devil. And that was immediately before the outbreak. In 1691, some of the villagers quarrel with Samuel Parris and stop paying his salary. So now we got a real division in the church, and this is one of the things that makes this an incendiary situation. You got people that are loggerheads over their church and getting angrier and angrier, and eventually breaks out into a conflict within the church, which then spreads. Okay, let me tell you something about some of the characters here. Cotton Mather would be what we would consider a really a precocious child. He graduated from Harvard at the age of 15 with his A.B. He got his M.A. about 3 years later. In those days, he said to get your master's degree, it took 5 years and $5 and 5 years out of jail. And that's all it took, really. You didn't have. There was not much formal study involved. His father, Increase Mather, had started Harvard when he was 12. Took a year off, so I think he was like a year later. It took him 4 years rather than 3 to get through Harvard. He wrote over 450 books. And during the witchcraft trials, he was a teacher at the Second Church in Boston. There's a lot of misconception. The ministers here, and he was an advocate of the trials, wrote a book and saying that the trials were properly conducted. Ministers had no legal authority whatsoever. In fact, the law disbarred them from holding any magistracy, judgeship, anything like that. They couldn't have any civil authority. Mentioned Paris. He was educated at Harvard. He didn't graduate. He inherited a plantation in Barbados. The place was wrecked by a hurricane, so he lost that, what is inheritance. He became a merchant in Boston, and then he decided he wanted to become a minister. He wasn't actually ordained. He became the minister in the church in Salem Village. A very prickly person, personalized all differences of opinion, and saw attacks on himself as attacks on the church. Something else I've recently encountered, there's a claim that he had books on witchcraft and demonology in his library. So whether or not his children came in contact with any of this information, we don't know. That's actually the remains of that's the foundations of the house. It's still there in Danvers. It's been excavated. Anyway, things in January 1692, two of the children, primarily Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Paris, started acting strangely. In February, the doctor that's treating the children says, well, it may be witchcraft. And Tituber breaks a witch cake, which is supposed to basically provide charms against the witches. That really sends Samuel Paris through the roof. They're practicing witchcraft right in my own parsonage here. Elizabeth Paris then accused Tituba and Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne and other people of being witches, and then they're now arrested and put in jail. This is in the good old days when they put you in prison. You have to pay to support yourself while you're there. You have to pay for your food and your lodging, while you're a guest of the state, as it were. Maybe it's a good idea to go back to it. In March 1692, Deodat Lawson paid a visit to the afflicted children. He was a former minister in Salem Village, and he later came to believe that his wife, who had died while he was a minister there, had been afflicted by one of the witches. But I'm going to go through, I want to talk his description he published about what he saw when he went there to the house. And he saw Abigail Williams, about 12 years of age, had a grievous fit. She was at first hurried with violence to and fro in the room, sometimes making as if she would fly, stretching up her arms as high as she could, crying "whish, whish, whish" several times. Now that part is very important. And probably Lawson probably just chilled his blood when he heard this, because the New Englanders were very familiar with this book, A Trial of Witches, which was published in 1682. It's about a trial in Lowestoft in England 20 years earlier in 1662. And this is actually, I'm taking this directly from the book. That another time the said child, this was Elizabeth Pacey, one of the afflicted children, being speechless but otherwise of perfect understanding, ran about the house holding her apron, crying, "Hush, hush." Okay. It's almost a duplicate of that child's behavior. Now, if you've read this and you see this, now there are two explanations. Skeptics would probably think Elizabeth Paris has probably, or Abigail Williams has probably heard discussions about this kind of behavior. The books, we know copies of the book are in New England. And so it's that, maybe the information's leaking that way. In his case, he's thinking, it's witchcraft, just like we've read about in this book. There's another one. Presently, after Abigail Williams said there was his good wife in, that's Goody Nurse, Rebecca Nurse, and said, "Do you not see her? Why, there she stands." And she said, good wife in offered her the book, presumably the book which she would sign up to be a member of Satan's church, and he just says, I won't take it, and so on. Okay. Again, from Trial of Witches, about another afflicted child, Jane Bocking. She discoursed with some persons in the room, though she could give no answer or seemed to give notice of any person then present, and would in like manner cast abroad her arm, saying, "I will not have it, I will not have it," and so on. It's a very similar kind of affliction. Again, probably been exposed to this, to descriptions of, the afflicted in that probably Abigail Williams has been exposed to this information, and she's either consciously or unconsciously copying it. But of course, from Lawson's perspective, this has got to be really blood chilling, because it looks like he's repetition of this event, this witchcraft case in England. The examinations of the accusers and accused took place in this building. This is Nathaniel Ingersoll's ordinary. It's his tavern. And you can go there, it's still there. You can see it. They made a big mistake here. They questioned the accused and accusers together. They didn't separate the accusers. Standard forensic procedure nowadays would be to separate all the witnesses, not allow them to talk to each other, and question them separately, and then compare their stories to see if they're consistent or not. This is basically done by Jonathan Corwin and John Hawthorne. In any case, Tituba now confesses to be practicing witchcraft and confirms that Good and Osborne are also witches. More young girls join the accusers. More women are accused of witchcraft, including Martha Corey, Rebecca Nurse, who's a very well-respected member of the church, Dorcas Good, Elizabeth Proctor. By April now, they have more villagers accused. Sarah Cloyce, who is Rebecca Nurse's sister, John Proctor, Giles Corey. One of the accusers, Mary Warren, tries to break ranks, but then she rejoins the accusers. They accuse the former Salem village minister, George Burroughs. The accusation spread to neighboring Andover. This is where it's spinning out of control. You've got lots and lots of people. Now you've got accusations in other townships, in neighboring townships. In Andover, Abigail Hobbs confesses to being a witch and names other witches. That's very handy. And so this is actually from her actual transcript of her actual confession. What sights did you see? I have seen dogs and many creatures. What dogs do you mean? Ordinary dogs? I mean the devil. How often? Many times, but once. Tell the truth. I do tell no lie. What appearance was he in then? Like a man. Okay. Where was it? At the eastward at Casco Bay. Anybody know where Casco Bay would be? It's in Maine, right? That was then part of Massachusetts. That's important. That's very much on the frontier. Hobbs and many of the accusers are refugees from that area because it has been subjected to intense Indian attacks, and they've had to flee for their lives. Where? In the house or in the woods? In the woods, in the night or in the day? In the day. How long ago? About 3 or 4 years. Okay. This really blows the lid off of everything. She's confessing, and she's naming names. Okay. And this is throughout Andover. Now, come back to Andover. Andover's very important when we discuss the explanations here. Now, finally, the royal governor arrives. He establishes a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, to hear and determine. And he puts it under Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, prominent judges John Hawthorne, Nathaniel Saltonstall, Samuel Sewell. The Essex County impanels a grand jury and a petty jury to hear cases. Now in June, Cotton Mather suggests the court not use spectral evidence. He didn't attend most of the trials, and so he sort of assumed that they were following his recommendation. And he didn't realize that they basically were used, almost all the trials were based on spectral evidence. They convict Bridget Bishop. She's sentenced to death. Rebecca Nurse is acquitted initially, and then Stoughton says the jury the presiding judge says you should reconsider the verdict. They do, and she's now convicted, condemned to death. I'll tell you something about Phipps. He was born in Maine. He was a successful treasure hunter. He actually made his first big pot of money by marrying a wealthy widow. Apparently that's fairly common in Massachusetts. He had commanded a naval expedition against Port Royal in Acadia, that's in Canada, and he then led an expedition against Quebec, which was a failure. That left the Massachusetts saddled with a very heavy debt, about 40,000 pounds, which in those days, that's up in the millions. So they've got this heavy debt now too that they've got to worry about. He does some good things in this, but you have to read some of his letters back to the government in London. And it's really kind of crazy stuff, like he's justifying, these witchcraft trials by saying people were flying through the air to the Sabbats and stuff like that. It's just loony stuff. Now, William Stoughton was really the head of the Court of Warrior Intermiter. He's a very well-educated man. He has an A.B. from Harvard. He has an A.M. from Oxford. He was actually ejected from a fellowship at Oxford at the time of the Restoration when they brought back Charles after the end of the Civil War. So he was brought back Charles II. He left England. He was a minister in Dorchester, and then he was lieutenant governor for 9 years. Very well respected, though obviously a fairly rigid person and a theological conservative. He's really kind of he's not a sweet looking guy. That's just the thing, he just doesn't warm the cockles of your heart when you look at him. Hawthorne was born in Salem. The widow of his brother had married George Burroughs. I often wondered if that was the woman that Burroughs supposedly murdered. Nowadays you couldn't do this because you'd have a conflict of interest, but in those days, to have any kind of a court, you had to simply ignore relationships. And I know this person, I've been in business with this person, I'm related to this person. And he was a member of the court here, and he and Jonathan Corwin conducted most of the preliminary examinations. And basically, they gathered the initial evidence before they actually brought people to trial. Okay. July 1692, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Good, Sarah Wiles were hanged on Gallows Hill. That was the first execution. Susanna Martin actually confessed to being a witch. She'd already been tried and acquitted once about a decade earlier. She was pretty blunt that she would given herself to the devil. She had definitely gone to the devil. August, John and Elizabeth Proctor convicted. George Burroughs is convicted, sentenced to death. A number of others, and then Burroughs and others and John Proctor are hanged. Elizabeth Proctor is spared because she's found to be pregnant. So they're not going to hang the innocent child that she's carrying. They'll wait till she delivers the child and then they'll hang her. Okay, they'll get to that. Okay, she managed to live long enough for the whole case the whole thing to collapse, and this is what happened with the Andover witches. We'll get to them. Virtually all of them confessed, and so they were never brought to trial. They were sort of put aside. Well, we'll try the people that are denying that they're witches, and then we'll get back to these people later. Well, they all survive because they of course they have to stay in jail and they get sick, and it's probably not a very good place to be. But when it's all over, they're released, and they're never brought to trial, which is unfortunate in one respect. It's good for them, but unfortunate for the historical record because we don't really know much about them. Okay, there's Gallows Hill right there, and there's Burroughs where he's reciting the Lord's Prayer correctly. Giles Corey is accused, but he won't plead. And apparently he's under the impression that if he doesn't plead, they can't try him and they can't then condemn him and they can't seize his property, which was what they were doing also. They just put him on the ground, put weights on his chest, rocks on his chest until he finally dies. Okay. And then they go through and they have a number of other hangings. Mary Easty is also hanged. She's a sister of Rebecca Nurse. They almost make a clean sweep of that family, the women in that family. Wilmot Redd is another person that may very well have sought a reputation as being a witch. She's from Marblehead, and she's had broken into a neighbor's house and robbed it, and then there was a teenage girl there, and she told the teenage girl, if you say anything to anybody, I'm going to bewitch you and your family to death. Now, they get you hanged pretty much anywhere. In England, anywhere else, that kind of crime. Now, October, we've almost gone a full year here. Cotton Mather produces a defense of the trial. His father denounces the use of spectral evidence. He's published a book saying this is really a bad thing to do. This is a mistake. There are also a couple of other published critiques which we're going to talk about. At this point, Governor Phipps decides to block all further use of spectral evidence, and then prohibits further arrests, releases many of the accused witches, and dissolves the court of Aurea Intermiter. It's almost brought to an end. Now I'll talk about the sort of the last few events in this, but go mention something. I mentioned that Mather wrote a book. This was a defense of the trial. He prepared it for that purpose, and he discusses only a selection of the cases. And Governor Phipps directed that he include the trial of George Burroughs. George Burroughs was, nominated by his neighbors to be Satan's vicar on earth. He's the head of the anti-church. That's really great. That's what everybody, your neighbors think of you. He apparently was a fairly difficult and obnoxious person, and may have been may have abused his wives. He may have been either physically or mentally. The book that Increase Mather wrote was Cases of Conscience, and he was a minister of Old North Church, where they hung the lanterns later. Okay, he was president of Harvard College, although mostly in absentia, and he basically argued Satan could send forth specters of innocent people that touch tests with the devil's testimony, and that the accuser's testimony had a diabolical origin, that it should have been disregarded. So it's a pretty scathing indictment of this, and considering that there are a lot of people who believe that there really are witches, and that these are the people that they're catching really are witches, this is a pretty, he's swinging against a lot of the current here. He's saying, I don't believe the legal process is just simply wrong. And he attacks it to the legal evidence root and branch. Samuel Willard writes he's a minister. He's also a Harvard graduate. He had dealt with a case of demonic possession earlier when he was a minister in Groton, Massachusetts. And he was the minister of the Third Church in Boston. He wrote the preface to Cases of Conscience, and then he wrote his own book, Some Miscellaneous Observations on Our Present Debates Respecting Witchcrafts, in a dialogue between S and B, between Salem and Boston, between those rubes out there and us up here, the city on the hill, we are the smart people. And he repeats the arguments of Increase Mather, that the evidence is simply too flawed to have any use in any court. Thomas Brattle wrote a circular letter to the intellectual elite. He's usually described as being a wealthy merchant. He's a congregant of Samuel Willard. He's really the first real empirical scientist in the British colonies. He's a friend of Robert Boyle, the chemist, architect Christopher Wren, astronomer John Flamsteed, and his observations were used by Newton in the Principia, his observations of the comet of 1680, 1681, and that's the kind of the comet there. So he's a very sharp guy. And he knows a lot of good bit about contemporary science and mathematics, and he basically produces some sort of scientific arguments. He repeats the theological criticisms. He didn't like the fact that high status accused were treated more leniently than low status people, and then he added some strictly scientific objections. The touch test is based on the Cartesian theory of effluvia, the malefic particles, and he criticized the use of that. So that is a mistaken use of that theory. And he pointed out that they claim to be able to see specters, and you can't see specters when your eyes are shut. You can't see. So that didn't make it. Their claims were false for that reason. Okay, the General Court of Massachusetts, which is the governing legislative body, establishes a superior court to try the remaining witnesses. We're now in November 1692, and then in January, the superior court orders the execution of the condemned whose hangings were postponed, say because of pregnancy. Governor Phipps blocks the order, and then most of the remaining accused are released from jail. And then by May, he's pardoned everybody. About more than a year after this thing started, he pardons those that are still in jail. Okay, so, all right, let's say something about the afflicted. Who were they? The afflicted accusers in Salem and Andover, and that's the biggest body of them. There are about 17 women, 2 men. The women's ages range from 9 to 36. For men, we don't know the age of one. We know one of them was the age of about 16. The core accusers consisted of Abigail Williams, who was 11 or 12, Ann Putnam Jr., who was 12, Betty Hubbard, who was a servant, 17, Mercy Lewis, who is actually the real ringleader of this. She's a servant, she's age 19. Mary Walcott, who's 17, Mary Warren, this is the one who tried to break free from the group of accused, and then later went back to them. She's 20, and then Susanna Sheldon was 18. So this is the core group here. We know a little bit about them, not much. We know something about what happened in terms of what they experienced. The fits, they first had spasmodic movements of the head and limbs, feelings of being pinched, scratched, or bitten, temporary paralysis, inability to breathe, accompanied by sensations of choking, hallucinations. And as time passed, the hallucinations became more specific. The afflicted saw specters of the accused and specters of the black man. These specters attempted to get the afflicted to sign Satan's book. You saw that in the case of the Deodat Lawson's description of one of Abigail Williams' fits. They partake of the wine and bread of the Sabbath, in addition to biting or pinching the afflicted. The specters threatened to tear the afflicted to pieces, and then eventually specters of victims of the accused witches started crying out for vengeance. So, we had a multiplication of specters here. Okay. During examinations before magistrates, they experienced these fits. They would be precipitated by the glance of the accused or the accuser. By the specter of the accused. The afflicted could be rendered mute or caused to mimic the speech and movement of the accused. These fits in court were used as almost the basis for almost all of the indictments. They met a legal requirement of having 2 witnesses to an act of witchcraft. It was real simple. So you might, have somebody accused brought into court, and then in the course of the appearance in court, the afflicted go into fits, and then that establishes their guilt because they're using the spectral evidence. Okay. So example, this is actually from the trial transcript. Trial examination of John Proctor. What do you say, Goodman Proctor, to these things? I know not, I am innocent. Abigail Williams cried out. There is Goodman Proctor going to Mrs. Pope, and immediately said Pope fell into a fit. The court, you see the devil will deceive you. The children could see what you was doing, you was going to do before the woman was hurt. I would advise you to do repentance, for the devil is bringing you out. In other words, the devil is betraying you. Abigail Williams cried out again, there's Goodman Proctor going to hurt Goody Bibber, and immediately Goody Bibber fell into a fit. So you get a flavor of what it was like in that courtroom. It was kind of a madhouse, quite literally. Okay. The accused were initially the usual suspects, low status, middle-aged women who had previous brushes with authority. Think of Susanna Martin, Bridget Bishop, and so on. The accused men were initially just relatives. They were sort of collateral damage. Husbands, brothers, sons. As the witchcraft intensified, men were charged in their own right, George Burroughs. Increasing numbers of high-status individuals were eventually accused. The wife of Governor Phipps, Captain John Alden, the son of John and Priscilla, the Priscilla Alden of the Mayflower, Reverend Samuel Willard himself. That's where things began to get dodgy, and it's at the point where there's more questions being raised about the whole process. Just to give you kind of an idea of what we're looking at here, these are numbers of actual witchcraft cases. I went through and listed them, given numbers. This big spike, that's Salem. To give you some feel for what's going on at the contemporary time, down there, Galileo dies and Newton is born. You have 1662, Skeptical Chemist is published. That's Robert Boyle's great book. Principia is published just before the outbreak here. You have King William's War occurring here. This is the Second Indian War, King Philip's War, which is much shorter. That's known as the First Indian War. That was more like a civil war because the Indians were living within the confines of the colonies, and so there was there were ambushes, and there was a big battle in Rhode Island. It was called the Great Swamp Fight. Explanations. Well, the one that William Stoughton preferred was that the accused were all guilty. And he never recanted of that position throughout his entire life until he died. The other explanation, and one that's been fairly commonly favored, is that the accusers were lying, that their fits in and out of court were frauds. One recent historian describes the accusers as a group of girl juvenile delinquents. I'm not sure that on what basis beyond the fact that they were part of the accusers you could say that. And of course, The Crucible, Arthur Miller's play, is based on the fraud explanation. But it would be fair to say that majority of modern historians basically accept that the innocence of the accused, because there really are no witches, and the reality of the afflictions. The afflictions seemed too severe and lasted too long to be wholly due to fraud. There's 1-2 episodes in the course of the trials where there seems to be definite fabrication, but they're not common, and these fits are really severe, and they go on for long periods of time. So, I think the consensus of modern historians is, yeah, there's something going on here beyond just their group of wayward girls who are lying and want attention or something like that. There is some natural causes advanced. And you'll see this in some television documentaries, and they offered ergotism as one explanation, encephalitis, specifically encephalitis lethargica as natural explanations. One is a toxin, the other infection. The ergotism idea was actually published a number of years ago in the journal Science, and the idea was that Thomas Putnam he farmed the area along the Ipswich River and had a lot of low-lying, kind of boggy fields. And he grew rye there, and it would have become ergot contaminated because it was the wet conditions. And then his contaminated rye would have gone into Paris's pantry, and then the girls would have gotten, had these, both the Putnam people in the Putnam family, and also the girls would have been, affected by the toxins in the contaminated rye. And there were wet seasons immediately before this, so that there would have been, likely be contaminated. You get the development of these spores, fungal spores, basically growing on the heads of the rye. There are a lot of stuff in here. You've got ergotamine and ergonavine, and these are all closely related to LSD. So, maybe they're all really high. Okay.
Nobody heard the LSD.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's LSD. They're all very closely related in structure to LSD. In fact, their starting points. Actually, Hoffman, when he synthesized LSD, he used these ergot alkaloids as a starting point. Okay. And then he contaminated himself and went on a trip trying to bicycle home from his lab. It's a famous case of how they discovered it was hallucinogen. The use of moldy rye is supposedly responsible for St. Anthony's fire ergotism. It's characterized by gangrene of the limbs because of the constriction of the blood vessels, your fingers and toes, and basically your extremities sort of rot and fall off. Okay, and also you have hallucinations. The gangrenous form is caused by the powerful alpha agonist effects of the ergot alkaloids and their associated CNS stimulatory effects. So it just basically constricts all the blood vessels. And you get that. That's at somebody's foot. And you can see the three of the toes there are, gangrenous. Okay. Problem is, and this was advanced, but then shortly thereafter, somebody pointed out there is no evidence of the gangrenous form of ergotism in Salem. There's no record of that. And you get the convulsive form, the hallucinatory form, when there's a severe deficiency of vitamin A in the diet. Vitamin A occurs in fish and dairy products. And you can probably guess that, given their location, that the Salem villagers were probably eating fish and milk quite a bit. So somebody pointed out that this really doesn't work very well as an explanation. And also, we will point out it doesn't work very well when you start looking at the witchcraft accusations elsewhere, out of the Salem town and Salem village. Okay, The encephalitis idea was advanced by Laurie Wynne Carlson. There was an outbreak of this disease between 1916 and 1930. It had restlessness, delirium, hallucinations, delusions, lethargy, stupor, muscular rigidity. Mortality rates were very high in London, they were between 20 and 40% of the people who contracted the disease. In Austria, they were 40%. Now, right away, none of the afflicted died in Salem. And remember, it says lethargy, stupor, and muscular rigidity. These people are having fits. You know, the exact opposite of this. But she says, oh, no, so this fits very well to the account. Also, by the way, the hallucinations were typically auditory in epidemica lethargica. What these people are experiencing in Salem is visual hallucinations, so it doesn't work at all. Anyway, this encephalitis outbreak was probably due to an arbovirus. Okay. Chadwick Hansen advanced the idea that the accusers were victims of mass hysteria. And we would call, hysteria or mass sociogenic illness or mass sociogenic illness by proxy. Those are all common terms in the DSM, whatever now it is, I guess it's now 4. And that many of the accusations were directed at practicing witches or at those who had by their actions acquired the reputation of a witch. In other words, maybe these people, some of the accused were really kind of guilty. And he pointed out that George Burroughs sort of courted he wanted the reputation of having some sort of occult powers. Wilmot Red definitely did. Susanna Martin, said she was a witch and had given herself to the devil. So maybe these people, they have a mass hysteria. People who are, these accusers are just scared to death of these people, and that produces these hysterical reactions. And a lot of them do sort of follow some of the hysterical behavior, described by Charcot and Freud. Okay. Another one was, this book here, published by Boyer and Nissenbaum, an exhaustive study, the bitter feuds in Salem Village, and they didn't have, these occurred without any adequate means of resolution. This book, by the way, is very commonly assigned in courses in American studies, so it's very highly thought of. And they interpreted the witchcraft trials as a fight between the Putnams, who are farmers in the western part of the village, and the Porters, wealthy landowners and merchants in the eastern part of the village. Okay, none of the Porters were actually ever accused. And so the idea is that the accused are seen as surrogates for Porter family members or associates too powerful to be accused directly. Well, you can then, that kind of argument, then you could never disprove that kind of theory by any kind of evidence, because you would always have, somebody was a surrogate for this person over here rather than being accused in their own right. In any case, as we'll see, the focus in most of these explanations is we're looking at Salem Village. Why? Because we have the trial transcripts. We know a lot about what happened there. Okay? But there's a problem, because that's not where that's where a lot more witchcraft accusations. Let's see here. Let me go through this real quick. We've got 20 in Danvers. We've got 19 in Salem. We've got 1 up in Amesbury. We've got where's my next one show up? 1 in Marblehead, that's Wilmot Red. 2 in Ipswich. We've got Manchester by the Sea has 2. We have 4 in Beverly. We have, 5 up in Haverhill. We have, what's my next one came up? Yeah, down at Gloucester, yeah. And we got, you're not from New England, say Gloucester. It's Gloucester, everybody knows that. Anyway, let's get through the end of it. We've got 43 in Andover. 43. There are more in Andover than there are in Danvers, which is Salem Village, and Salem itself. 39 versus 43. Okay? Well, you very carefully explain what happened down here. You think, well, what happened up here? What was going on up there? It's a different village. It's a different topography. So even the ergot thing wouldn't work very well. So, and the problem is, we don't know very much about those 43 witches. They weren't brought to trial. The Andover Historical Society was going to do an extensive study about the witches to find out as much as they could. That has not yet been published. I don't know if they've really, whether they really followed through on that or not. But it would be nice to know, if you're going to form a theory, let's look at all the evidence. Let's not, take a very select, out of those 39, remember that like 150 people are accused. Okay, so you're talking about a really small subset. Now, they had more than, Andover had more witches than Salem Village or Salem Town. They confessed and named other witches. They weren't brought to trial, so we don't know very much about them. Okay, we don't have the records of the interrogations and the trial and so forth. So we have nothing. We have very little. Okay. John Putnam Demos came up with the idea that he looked at a broader scale, looked at all the witchcraft accusations. He thought most of them involved young women who were the accusers, accusing postmenopausal women who had failed to acquire wealth, status, or a large number of offspring. These were the accused. And even he admits, well, this works well for most of the witchcraft in New England. It doesn't work for Salem, particularly because you have a lot of men being accused as well. And also, Elizabeth Proctor had children. So many of these people were actually pretty well-to-do. Rebecca Nurse had a nice farm. In fact, it's still there. So, the theory doesn't work. It works well for everything but Salem. Another one says, well, they were all uppity women. Unfortunately, we don't know whether any of the women who weren't accused might have been uppity women. We have a characteristic you think belongs to this group of accused, and that's the explanation for why they're accused, but you don't look at any non-accused people. So it's not a good way of doing it. It's not a good form of historical argument. It's a fallacy of composition kind of thing. I like best the Mary Beth Norton's theory that there were just these stresses produced by the First and Second Indian Wars. In the case of Salem, and this would have been true of a lot of the other areas, the accusers and accused had lived together in the small villages and farms on the Maine frontier, and many accusers had lost family members in Indian attacks on the Maine frontier. I'm thinking that you could make a case for, at least in the case of Mercy Lewis, post-traumatic stress disorder, that she's seen people killed violently. She's been in a situation where possibly suffered violent death at the hands of the Wabanaki Indians. So we have these people suffer these stresses. They've had to flee their homes because of these attacks. And the King William's War actually was instigated by Count Frontenac, the French governor of Canada. One of the first was an attack on Dover, New Hampshire, which is near the coast. And Major Richard Waldron was captured by the Indians. He was tortured to death. The town was burned to the ground. About half the people were massacred. The remainder were carried away and sold into slavery. This is a very violent time. These people aren't, if they're taking you prisoner, they're taking you to be a slave, or they're going to sell you to the French in Canada. And they're going to march you there, and if you lag behind, they'll probably kill you. Okay. There were other attacks in various places in Maine, New Hampshire, Groton, Massachusetts, Schenectady, New York. And so there's just this influx of people just flowing from the frontier, going back into these compacted areas around Salem Village and Boston and so forth. And particularly Essex County got a lot of people from the Maine frontier. And the townships immediately north and west of Salem Village were exposed to Indian attack. In fact, during the Salem Witchcraft Trial, there was an Indian attack on Billerica, home of one of the confessed witches, and she's one who confessed that she had covenanted with Satan for his protection against the Indians. They were believed to be minions of Satan. They were agents of Satan, and it worked well for her. She was in jail when the town was attacked, so she was saved. So she wasn't there when the attack took place. And I'm going to give you an example here from 1697, which was after the trials, but give you an example of what we're dealing with here. Hannah Dustin was a farm wife on a farm near Haverhill, and her home was burned by the Indians, and her newborn child was dashed to death against a tree. She, her nurse Mary Leff, and a neighbor boy named Samuel Leonardine were carried away as captives. They were camping in the snow in about midway up New Hampshire, going back to Canada. And she gets out of her bonds in the middle of the night, gets a hatchet, and she kills 10 of the Indians. Two of the Indians escape. One is an Indian woman who escapes into the forest injured, probably dies of exposure. She scalps the dead Indians and then gets a $5 bounty for each of the scalps. She goes, I've got 50 pounds in my hand right here. I'm carrying this back to Boston to get my reward. Okay. She, by the way, that's a statue of her on the village green in Haverhill. She's the first woman in what is now the United States to have a bronze statue erected in her honor. She has two, one in Haverhill, and guess where the other one is? It's up there in New Hampshire, where she killed the Indians. Okay, and if you can see it here, what do you think she's got in her right hand? She's got a hatchet. In fact, there's one of the museums in Haverhill. That's supposedly the hatchet. Okay, actually, there's another one that has the hatchet too. So we may doubt the hatchets. Okay. Yeah, holy relics, exactly. She got a cash award from the governor of Maryland. She got a engraved tankard for killing these, wiping out this Indian raiding party. In addition to the 50 pounds, she got interviewed and written up by Cotton Mather in one of his books. I mean, that's like hitting the front page of USA Today. Okay. And most of the New Englanders thought there was a conspiracy against them involving the French, the Wabanaki Indians, and so even some of their English leaders. They believed that one of the reasons the Indians had modern firearms and black powder was that they were being supplied by people like John Alden, who traded in Maine. The black man claimed to be seen by so many of the afflicted accusers would have been an Indian sachem or shaman. That's their theory. Okay. For New Englanders, in their lexicon, black does not equal African, it equals Indian. And remember that Abigail Hobbs encountered the black man in the woods in Maine. Okay, presumably she's encountering some of these Wabanaki sachems. And of course, George Burroughs lived up there, and he was a protege of a particularly reviled person, Joshua Scatto. He had a stockade village. He's defending it. They're from a Wabanaki attack. A group of militiamen are trapped. They're pinned down a couple of miles away. The militiamen in the stockaded village want to go to their relief. And he says, if you leave, I'm putting your families out there outside the stockade for the Wabanakis to get them. Of course, now this Burroughs is his protege. He's a very close associate. So probably some of that, you think about the vileness that people would attach to that kind of action just rubbed off on Burroughs. Mercy Lewis, again, the headquarters, she lived on the Maine frontier. At one time, she lived in the same house with Burroughs. She saw a lot of the casualties, people being killed, the results of these Indian attacks and so forth. And then she wound up, and in her case, pretty much her family lost everything. She winds up being a servant in somebody else's house. Goes from having perhaps a fairly comfortable existence to living, as a servant and having very few prospects of getting married now. Now let's take an even wider view. Let's look at Europe. The reason I'm going to talk about this is because I want you to be aware that 19 people is bad, but what the Europeans did was a whole lot worse. Thousands of lives, okay? And the accused witches were typically tortured and mutilated, which they did not do in Salem. They were executed by burning, again, not done in Salem. Germany was the main locus of the witch hunt hysteria, but there were other places as well. Scotland, there were 4,000 witches executed, all of them by burning. A lot of them chased down by James I, James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England. By the way, the only monarch to actually write a book on how to hunt for witches. These people did, just tremendous. This is actually a graph, actual numbers. This is southwestern Germany. It goes up to the number right here. This is 800. These are actual executions, not people just tried. These are people actually executed. One German magistrate supposedly tried, convicted, and executed 900 witches personally. I mean, we're not, Salem's not even in their league, okay? They see Salem in their rearview mirrors. They're not, they're way out of that league, okay? Another example here is Matthew Hopkins. He's now English. This is in Essex, England, and became the witch finder general. And in the period over in 1645, 1646, he goes around. He looks for witches. He gets 19 tried and executed in Chelmsford. That's as many as in all of Salem. They get witchcraft accusations spread elsewhere. A lot of the towns like Sudbury, the one in England there's one in Massachusetts. It keeps going on. And when it's in, it's about 100 to 200 witches, that Hopkins accounts for when it's all over. What happened to the aftermath in Salem? Let's talk a little bit about that. Stoughton went on to become acting governor. Phipps went back to England and tried to explain what he had done, died there. Stoughton became Harvard's most important financial benefactor, and he never admitted any error in the trials. Thought that everything was done properly. The Mathers suffered a lot of setbacks in their efforts to preserve the power of conservative Protestantism. Increase Mather was maneuvered out of the presidency of Harvard, and Cotton Mather, who had hoped, and his father had hoped that he would become president, he was passed over. They didn't want any of the Mathers anymore. Samuel Willard became acting president of Harvard. He's one of the opponents of the trial. Sometimes the good guys win out in the end. And one of the things about him is the year he died, he baptized Benjamin Franklin. Thomas Brattle went on to become the treasurer of Harvard and de facto professor of mathematics and science. So he now becomes the person who is instructing these students in what would be modern science. What happened to the accusers? Abigail Hobbs married and raised a family. Mercy Lewis had a child out of wedlock up on the Maine frontier, married the child's father, moved to Boston. No further record of her. Susanna Shelton was warned out of Providence, Rhode Island as a person of evil fame. She died sometime before 1697. She may have been the person who was playing around with fortune telling. Abigail Williams, Mary Warren, can't be traced. Elizabeth Parris married and had 5 children. Thomas Putnam and his wife, were deeply involved with those. The wife was involved in the charge. They both died in 1699, and they didn't leave anything behind for their offspring because they were heavily in debt. And Putnam Jr., who was part of the core accusers, she died unmarried in 1715. She did produce a kind of a confession, well, let's say a statement of contrition. Some people call it a confession, but she basically produced a statement of contrition saying that she had, the people that she had accused were really innocent. She never admitted that she did it for any, malicious purpose, but that because she was deluded by Satan, and that this was part of the requirement, I think, for her to become a church member in the Salem Village Church. But anyway, that's kind of the end of what happened to them. We don't know too much about, most of the others, and what happened to a lot of the accused witches who were later released. They kind of disappear from history. We do know that the state of the Massachusetts Bay Colony did have some contrition for what they'd done. 4 years after they pardoned everybody, they had a fast day. Because of the anger of God being directed against the colony, Samuel Sewell had a statement read in church begging pardon for his role in the trials. Thomas Fisk and 11 petty jurymen, that would have been the entire jury, recanted their verdicts, blaming the conviction of innocence on the mysterious delusions of Satan. They said these people really were innocent. We got carried away here. In 1711, Massachusetts paid restitution to the accused or their survivors. I think the Proctor family may have gotten 50 pounds out of it. It went on a sort of a sliding scale downward. And During the first quarter of the 18th century, Massachusetts reversed the attainders of the convicted witches on a case-by-case basis. Now it's important. This is obviously, you would have preferred this not occur, but they recognized they'd done something very seriously wrong, did what they could after the fact to at least indemnify some of the survivors or the people who were relatives of those who were executed. No European government ever did this. No government in Germany, no government in, the English government never did it. They never once admitted that they were ever wrong in these prosecutions. So the people in the Massachusetts prisons actually come out looking pretty good. They did what they could do after the fact. They recognized they'd done something very, very wrong. There are no, in Massachusetts, there are no further trials. Now there are some episodes of witchcraft that never result in trials, but there are no further trials for witchcraft in Massachusetts. You can go there now to Salem. There you can see the converted church, the Salem Witch Museum. It's you have the Rebecca Nurse houses there. I've been there. It's actually it's fascinating. My wife knew a member of the Nurse family, and her body is supposedly buried somewhere secretly on that farm, but they won't tell anybody. There is a monument to her. And notice it says that she was born in Yarmouth, England. That's a couple of miles from Lowestoft. She and Mary Eastie were both, her sister, were both born there. And very close to this witchcraft outbreak in 1662, which is just kind of a weird little aside here. Okay. You can go to the museum. There's Tituba over there, represented as an African American. Okay. All right. What about witchcraft in America after Salem? The prosecutions for witchcraft ended in the early 1700s. Parliament basically got rid of the witchcraft statute in 1736. And so they had no criminal basis. Maryland's last trial was in 1712. In that case, the accused was acquitted. In Virginia, it was 1706. The accused in that case had actually sued individuals for about 10 years earlier for slander, for saying that she was a witch, and actually won a small judgment. And now she was accused. And they did, in this case, they actually did the ducking test, where you were trussed up, usually hand tied to opposite foot. Okay, right hand to left foot, left hand, and then thrown in the water. And if you floated, you were being rejected by the water, which is of course the liquid that's used in baptism. And so that's a sign that you are a witch. If you sink, you're innocent. Okay, unfortunately, she floated. She was not executed. She was imprisoned. And it's unfortunate because think about that. If that's a test, strong discrimination against women. You're more buoyant than men are typically. So you have that. You're already at a disadvantage. And down there, and this occurred in Virginia Beach, and down there in Virginia Beach, you can find the location where this took place. It's Witch Duck Point, and there's an adjacent Witch Duck Bay, and you get there by going on Witch Duck Road, where they capitalize on this association. Okay. However, belief in witchcraft is found in just about every ethnic group in the U.S. population, without exception. Native Americans, Italians, Polish, whatever. These people came over, they brought their folk beliefs with them, included belief in witchcraft. I'm going to mention just one group, the Pennsylvania Dutch. Of course, they had the hex signs, which now tell you about love and so forth, but really they were actually initially for protection against witches. And they have, and probably still have, powwows. These are herb doctors. And they have their grimoires, or manuals of charms and spells. There's the Long Lost Friend, which was published in Pennsylvania in 1820. It's one of the widely used books of charms. You, by the way, can go and find it downloaded from the internet. Egyptian Secrets is another. Supposedly written by Albertus Magnus, who was one of the great figures of the Middle Ages, who was also supposed to be all sorts of occult powers. Let's get to one of the last formal trials where somebody's accused of being a witch. And it involves Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, and she believed in such what's called malicious animal magnetism, and she thought that explained past outbreaks of witchcraft. People were actually using malicious animal magnetism, and she brought suit against one of her disciples, Daniel Harrison Spofford, and this supposedly using MAM, malicious animal magnetism, to harm one Lucretia Brown, a recluse who was also a Mary Baker Eddy disciple. Case was heard in Salem, Massachusetts. Okay, wow, how about that? In this case, the judge dismissed the case. She had no standing to bring a suit like this. And in any case, witchcraft isn't a crime. So what, you can't accuse somebody of actually using something like that. So, by the way, that is a picture of Mary Baker Eddy, in case you didn't recognize her. All right, so I actually started looking, what about other legal cases after Salem? And I actually did a LexisNexis search, and I came up with using witchcraft, witches, witch as search terms. That's the court, and do the legal look at that. Gives you appellate cases, Supreme Court cases, that sort of thing. Okay, so a lot of trial court findings aren't going to be in there unless things are appealed to a higher court. But I came over 700 cases which those terms appear. Now, one of the things I found going through them case by case is that modern American lawyers would pretty much be lost if they didn't have the phrase witch hunt that they could use somewhere in an argument, okay? And they would be pretty hopeless shape. However, you go through and you do find actions for slander and defamation, people suing because they're being defamed by being called witches. That stops after a while because the judges start saying, well, it's not a crime. Being a witch is not a crime, so you can't accuse them. So it's not slander and defamation to call them a witch. So we're not going to hear those cases anymore. Challenges to wills. The testator believed in witchcraft, so the judge should set aside the will. Okay. In one case, the evidence was that the people that had been original beneficiaries in an earlier will and were trying to overturn the present one were the people that were the wife and daughter that the testator believed were witches. He believed that his family members were actually witches, and he was writing the will to exclude them. Judge said, "I'm sorry, it just it doesn't reach the level of incapacity." So, we also have murders of suspected witches. People taking the law in their own hands. The law you can't charge somebody being a witch anymore, you can't prosecute them. So what do? Well, if you think you're being terrorized by a witch, maybe you go and kill them. Solomon Hotima, who was a Choctaw Indian, did that around in the 1890s, 1900s, and was actually convicted. He was actually convicted, wasn't sentenced to death, but he wound up dying in Atlanta Penitentiary, hoping that Teddy Roosevelt would give him a pardon. The house you're looking at there, the Nilsen Raymeyer house, that's the scene of one of the murders. This took place in 1928 in York, Pennsylvania. One of these Pennsylvania Dutch powwows believed that he was having all sorts of health problems. Another powwow told him that he was being bewitched by Raymeyer. Raymeyer's casting spells on him. So with two accomplices, this man, John Blymeyer, goes to Raymeyer's house. Intention, he's going to get a cutting of Raymeyer's hair, which he's going to burn. That's a counter charm against a witch. And he's going then he wants to get his hands, he wants to seize Raymeyer's copy of The Long Lost Friend, the grimoire, okay, which he's going to burn, he's going to destroy, okay? They get into a fight, and Raymeyer gets killed. So they now they try to cover the crime by setting the house on fire to burn the evidence up. Now that doesn't work. So ultimately they're charged, and Blymeyer, the perpetrator, is sentenced to, he gets a long prison term. The court decides he wasn't premeditated. It was because they got in a fight. The house actually, at the time, there was actually an extension like a barn off to the left there. This is now seeking to be added to a registry of historical places. The great-grandson of Remar owns it. And if you go upstairs, you can see they have a panel in the floor, a transparent panel that you can look through, and you can see the partially burned floor joists where they set fire to it. This led to a lot of conversation in newspapers about powwows. And American University invited a class there, invited a powwow from Pennsylvania Dutch country to come in 1931 and actually defend, their practices. And he told a newspaper reporter that he himself, by charms, had killed 5 witches by counter charms. Mostly now you'll find claims of religious discrimination in the, in the lawsuits. Somebody who's a Wiccan or somebody who wants to practice witchcraft, typically in prison. Though I found one funny one where a person was claiming that they were wrongfully discharged from working in a law firm because they were a Christian who did not believe in the witch beliefs of the lawyers. And I don't know what kind of law that law firm practices. I'd like to find out. It sounds kind of interesting. I haven't got more details about that particular case. Okay, so and just to remind you that there are people that still have witchcraft, still believe in witchcraft. You can walk into just about any bookstore, Barnes & Noble, you'll find all sorts of books on witchcraft. You can just buy all you want. You can download all the stuff from the web. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you something to take a takeaway here. I'm going to give you a spell from the long-lost friend. It's an acrostic, and if you write this out and you put it on a piece of paper, you put it in your barn, it'll protect your livestock against witchcraft. It's one of the three counter witchcraft charms in the long lost friend. There you go. There's the acrostic right there. You'll notice a very powerful one because no matter where you go, it reads the same way, whichever way you go. That's a very long standing one. But write that on a piece of paper, put it in your barn, and it'll protect your cows and your goats and your sheep, whatever. And so, if you want to go find information on Salem, the Salem Witch Trials Documentary Archive is at the University of Virginia. They have the trial transcripts. They have PDFs of the books like Cases of Conscience and these other, the Increase Mather's book, the Wonders of the Invisible, all the Cotton Mather's books and so on. So, questions? Yes, back over there.
Your thought about PTSD as being the trigger, perhaps, or the cause of this problem in Massachusetts, would there be a distribution of more of it towards the Indian frontier and less towards the coast? And then how would that figure in with the...
I don't know that it would work out that way. You would think so because of direct attacks. However, a lot of the coastal townships relied on seaborne trade, particularly to Massachusetts. And in one episode, the Wabanaki came out in canoes and they would capture the ships. They were coasting vessels that were traveling there. And then in one case, they captured the ship, put the crew below decks, and were setting off to go, I think probably to Louisburg, to Canada, to sell them to the French. The crew got loose, grabbed the Wabanakis, put them in the hold, sailed back to Marblehead. They got to Marblehead. There's a big mob of women on the pier. They're yelling, "What the hell did you bring these Indians back here for?" And so when they tried to land them, they were going to try to trade them for people that had been captured. This mob tore the Indians literally limb from limb. So everywhere it was probably that we're not that far away. And the Indians were able to raid fairly deeply. 2 Salem villagers were killed within the precincts of the village in the 2 years preceding the outbreak. So it's really a very thin population, so the Indian raiders can go, can strike pretty much anywhere.
Yes, the European ones, obviously, they didn't have Indian attacks.
Right. Right. One theory there began with it was climate related, crop failure related, that it started in the Duchy of Savoy and spread from there. But you're talking about and a lot of this is occurring during the wars of religion anyway, and then the English Civil War is occurring in the middle of the early part of this period. Yeah.
Is there some sense in which, down through history, people have just tried to cope with misfortune by finding some sort of scapegoat for it? Or, I mean,
Well, then you got the concept of the scapegoat right there.
but they don't think of it as a scapegoat.
Right.
They think of it as a real cause. I'm thinking about, there's still witches being executed in Africa.
Probably as well I've given this talk, there probably a couple of them have been lynched somewhere in the world. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the default condition for human beings. Yeah, the notion of contingent events, or the statement "shit happens." Most people don't believe that. If something bad happens, somebody's responsible for it. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned of the wars of religion is related to what I wanted to ask. My understanding that, contrary to the popular notion that there were lots of witch trials during the Middle Ages, that there were more during the Reformation.
Probably.
Also, I was under the impression that burning of witches was more typically done by Catholics, whereas the hanging was more typically done by Protestants. But you mentioned
Of course, here in Scotland, yeah, and executions were all by burning, and a lot of it at the instigation of, toward the end, in this period, a lot of the instigation of King James, who hunted down a whole bunch of partly because I think in the case of the witches he went after, he claimed they had tried to kill him. So their action was not only witchcraft but also treason.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, high treason was punishable by burning for women and by being hanged and drawn and quartered for men.
Yeah.
So, but like when Johannes Kepler's mother was tried as a witch, I think she was threatened with hanging, maybe?
I don't know. Yeah, they were Lutheran. It was Catholic, but you got the Scots that are doing it. One place, the story about burning witches. One village in Poland had so many witches to burn that they finally decided to construct a special furnace to burn them. The village is only a short distance from Auschwitz, as it happens, or not as it happens. It may not be entirely coincidental. Yes.
In the case of Salem, most of the accused were very young women.
Yeah.
But in Europe, what was the case there?
A lot of them were the afflicted in the Lowestoft trial, the Lowestoft case. The afflicted were all, now the people who were, bringing the legal accusations were adults, because children can't testify. And they had a problem in the Lowestoft case because the afflicted were so young and they weren't legally qualified, but they were children too. And that was one of the problems with the trial, because they had the most afflicted children, and one of them was so severely ill that the doctor said she can't even be brought to court to testify because she's so severely ill. In general, I don't know. It depended on a lot of the circumstances, and where this was taking place. Sometimes it was the children, sometimes it was the adults. Yeah, one last question. Yes.
What was the turning point that made them stop this?
I think probably when it was clearly running out of control, and they were accusing people like Samuel Willard and Governor Phipps's wife. You start messing with the elite, then that's it. And I think too there were real intellectual problems. Increased Mather. He publishes a book saying this is where you people really run off the rails. This is, you've got no good reason for what you're doing. It's wrong. It's a mistake. And I think partly he just reached a point. He had actually been asked he would ask for an opinion, and he got convened a group of ministers, and they said, don't use spectral evidence. And they kind of thought they were proceeding normally, and then they find out they've been using spectral evidence all along, and that excites him and Willard to start writing these, these publishing these books, attacking the whole basis. And that may have really.
Never involved in that stopping.
Well, there was no. Well, when you say church, there is. Well, you got people like Cotton Mather, who's a minister, and he's on one side. You had one of the ministers, Noyes, who is one of the ministers in Salem town, who's in favor of the trials. Deodat Lawson is in favor of the trials. Then you have Willard, who's a minister. You have Increase Mather, who's a minister. It kind of splits. There's kind of a split there among the ministers. There is no, of course, it's a congregational system. There is no hierarchy. There are no bishops. In fact, that's why they're in New England. They don't want bishops. They don't want a hierarchy. And so in a sense, every church is its own authority. So, Willard goes his way and Increase Mather. And I kind of, Increase Mather was probably a kind of rigid person, might have been a fun guy to go out with, but God, he had to be, a lot of people are really saying this is, we've got to deal with these witches, and he's saying, no, you've made a big mistake, and I'm publishing a book to say it, and I don't care what you think. This kind of, attitude of, rectitude and righteousness. I know what I believe. I am going to put it out there. And Willard too. Willard was really pretty brave here. But I think that was probably the turning point when people, and they may just be reflecting a lot of people's concern, hey, this is crazy. We got so many people in prison. This is nuts. 150 people have been accused. This is crazy. And nobody really said, yeah, the governor takes a series of steps to put an end to it. And I think he's being influenced by people like Increase Mather and Willard and so on. Yeah.
It does make you think of modern times panics like the daycare panics and the satanic panic.
Exactly the same thing. And I think, you have a situation where people earnestly believe that people are guilty, and it is a real panic. And it's not that they're really, they're just lying out of sheer maliciousness, but they really believe, and I know. I mentioned that, in case of one, and there was some evidence of some fabrication in the Salem Witchcraft Trials, an issue about a broken knife, which supposedly was used to stab one of the afflicted, and somebody in court recognized it as the knife he discarded in the field outside the court earlier that day. But I know that in one of the satanic panic cases, it's quite clear that family members were fabricating evidence.
Glad.